Boys and girls, do I have breaking news for you today? Not a moment to waste. You probably saw the thumbnail, you saw the headline. Let's talk about it. So, according to ESPN's Mark Raimondi, a very good reporter, a friend in the industry, I would say, he is reporting, and now it's been confirmed by Netflix as well. They have since put out a press release, but basically his initial report was that Jake Paul, fresh off of a win over, name him, Ryan Borland, over on DAZN, is now going to be fighting Mike Tyson. Ready for this? That's big enough news. July 20th, AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas, and it's going to be on Netflix. There's like 15 different levels of crazy to all of this. Let's talk about it. So let's go to the article from Mark Raimondi first, and let's start there. All right, so here's what it says. Jake Paul gives a bit of an introduction. The initial article, by the way, Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson set for July 20th on Netflix. Okay, so if you skip just a couple of intro paragraphs, here's where we go. Tyson will now face Jake Paul in a boxing match, July 20th, AT&T Stadium, Arlington, Texas, in the main event of a card that will air on Netflix, officials told ESPN, and will be the streaming company's first foray into combat sports and its third live sporting event overall. Paul's Most Valuable Promotions, that's the promotional company that he owns and runs, inked a deal with Netflix for a boxing card last November 1st, per MVP co-founder, Nikisa Badarian. Nikisa Badarian, a former UFC executive, although he appears to be on sour terms with UFC president Dana White. They give a couple of statements regarding how they feel, and then you get to this bit right here. It is unclear how the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, that is the Athletic Commission in Texas, which sanctions and regulates combat sports in the state, will approach what surely will be a matchup that garners plenty of criticism and attention. It is yet to be determined whether it will be classified as a pro fight or an exhibition. Okay, so let's get to this here if we can for just a second. There are other details. Let me just give you the first impression that I have. The first impression that I have is that this is absolutely enormous news for like any number of reasons. Jake Paul had been fighting MMA fighters for quite some time. It has gone very well for him, Nate Diaz being the last of those. I was there for the second Woodley fight. I was there for the first Woodley fight. I was there for the Anderson Silva fight. We covered those as part of Showtime. So I've been to a few of these bouts. I went to his brother's fight against Floyd Mayweather as well. And he's sort of been escalating, but it wasn't really clear where he was escalating to. He was taking on these guys who were like very unheard of, club level boxers or below, and blowing through them. He did have obviously a loss to Fury on ESPN, and had boxed in a few different places. But in his most recent state, had kind of moved to a position where he was just taking on regular no-name boxers that were like a very questionable quality. Not that that was any big scandal, but that was just what it was going on at the time. This is a dramatic escalation to something different. I mean, let's be real about this. By the time this fight happens, Jake Paul already turned in January 27 years of age. Mike Tyson will be 58 years of age by that time. This is hardly anything even approximating prime Mike Tyson. And so, while that can be said, 4 years ago against Roy Jones Jr. in an exhibition, Mike looked pretty good. I don't know how much degradation there's been since then, but you would have to imagine even at 48 years old, Mike Tyson's probably going to be one of his tougher fights, right? Even if degrading on a substantial curve. You're not expecting much from Tyson, but you would still imagine power, last thing to go. He's looked good, and for whatever it's worth on social media clips, again, that can be very, very debatable, its value, but this does seem like an escalation, even if it's a very calculated and doable one for Jake Paul in the end. So this is his biggest opponent to date in terms of names. He has been fighting nothing but kind of A-sides in MMA, including the great Anderson Silva, who was also in his 50s when they fought. And now he's taking on one of the most iconic boxers of my time, a hero, or I should say a giant towering figure. Hero is a bit of a stretch, but a giant towering figure in the world of boxing in the 80s, a very controversial figure and still towering figure in the 90s. And then, he obviously has had a bit of a reformation since then. So this is an enormous, enormous promotional step, certainly for Jake Paul. I do think it's probably going to be one of his tougher opponents, although that very much remains to be seen. And as Mark Raimondi indicated in his post, we don't even know if this is going to be pro or exhibition yet and how that could define the rules, how many rounds it will be, any number of those factors. There's simply no telling. But I got to tell you, I think one of the biggest stories for me in all of this genuinely has to be the inclusion of Netflix. The Netflix inclusion is an extraordinary thing. I don't think... Understand something about the streaming world. Netflix is by far, the biggest and most profitable streaming service there is. Amazon has 200 million subscribers. Netflix has 260. Not a gigantic difference, but the cultural cachet that Netflix occupies is radically different. And then you go down from there, and I think you got Paramount Plus around like 70 million. I think HBO Max well below that. ESPN Plus well below that, right? Hulu, I think, somewhere in that same kind of range. And there's other ones I'm not even mentioning, but for sure, those are the two only above 200 million, and 80 million of that, I think, for Netflix is in the United States. But they have a global reach that is truly, truly without any kind of peer. They are the faraway leaders, both in terms of reach, both in terms of being a first mover in the space, any number of different things. They are the kings. To get combat sports on there, and granted, we don't know what kind of involvement it actually means, but what you can say today, Netflix is now apparently going to be in the live event combat sports business. Just that alone is enormous news. There has never been any kind of platform that MMA has aired on that has that kind of reach today, in today's market, into the way television and broadcasting and streaming works. Never happened. This is totally, completely different. Wow, I'm actually kind of shocked by the whole thing. To get them involved, whether this is a one and done, we don't know, but to get them involved, potentially beyond just a Jake Paul fight, would be a huge, the amount of money that would be pumped into some of these events, and the scale and the size of them would truly be without precedent. Now, it gets me back to, I should say, not without precedent. Of course, we've seen big events, but I mean in the streaming era. Stateside, certainly. Obviously, Saudi Arabia has been a big event location, but bringing it back to the States, putting it on Netflix, that's unlike anything that combat sports has seen since the advent of, in the streaming world. It's the biggest thing for combat sports that could happen. Literally, that is it. The biggest thing that can happen for combat sports is they ink some variation of it, boxing, MMA, some promoter, UFC, Top Rank, whoever, ink some kind of deal with Netflix. It just can't get much bigger than that. I've said this before, but there have been shows that have aired on places like HBO Max that were never big hits. They then get put on Netflix, and it all of a sudden becomes a big hit because people just didn't see it on the other streaming services. They see it on Netflix. It's a very engaged audience as well. So that's just enormous. The other part that it gets back to is I wonder what this means for MMA fighters, because it seems like the days of him, unless this goes really badly for him, it seems like the days of fighting somebody who is a well-known but ultimately, sort of semi-moderately popular MMA fighter, the days of that guy getting a payday against Jake Paul, they might be dwindling, with the exception of Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor reportedly has 2 fights left in the UFC. He wants one in June, and he wants one at the closer to the end of the third or fourth quarter of the year. And at least that's what he said on social media this week. I think he wanted Chandler and then the trilogy with Nate Diaz. And then it's pretty clear he's probably looking for these kinds of paydays. The kind of payday that Conor McGregor, and I know that we hate to even say it if you're an MMA fan who's a purist, but let's be honest, if Jake Paul wins this and let's say looks reasonably good doing it, whatever that means for anyone, I'm not saying that you have to love that outcome, but let's just say that he gets to something like that. Him versus Conor McGregor, if such a fight ends up happening in boxing, would be for an enormous amount of money. Shocking amounts of money. Huge amounts of money. You couldn't believe it how many amounts of money. And I think Conor is probably looking to exit his UFC deal so he can get something like this, where the challenge is tough, but his sort of legacy is basically already, for the most part, secure. And this would be an enormous financial windfall that would garner global attention. What prize fighter wouldn't want something like that in the end? I know there's going to be a lot of criticism of this fight, which there should be. It's a guy at 27 taking on someone at 58 years old. By itself, that deserves an enormous amount of scrutiny and questioning, and that's going to put a lot of people off, and that's all fair. But I'm just asking a basic question. In terms of what Jake Paul is achieving through prize fighting, in terms of blowing up his name and securing generational wealth, what fighter would not want that path? They may not want to walk the path that he has, or at least they might say that they don't want to walk the path that he has. But this is turning into a gigantic operation for him, not just his promotional company MVP, but the amount of money that he's going to be able to generate through his fights in this kind of circuit that he has built for himself. And it seems like it's kind of interesting. It's kind of adjacent. And some MMA fans might hate this comparison because it's not apples to apples, and I'm letting you know that up front. But it kind of reminds me a little bit, this is not right at all, but a little bit of what Craig Jones is doing, where Craig is certainly much more legitimate as a world-class elite black belt. I please don't misunderstand me. But he, to his own admission, some of the more major titles he sought after, he has fallen short in. That's where some of the B team name kind of comes into play. Again, he is world-class elite. Jake Paul is not world-class elite. In that sense, the comparison completely falls apart. But in the sense of trying to put on matches that are of entertaining or name value, that come with significant financial windfall for the audience, which aren't necessarily in line with what the most prestigious sort of paths to legitimacy are. Again, he's done some of that and had some success, but now what he's doing is a little bit different. Again, the comparison doesn't work altogether, but these alternate routes outside of traditional models of legitimacy to capture essentially what the fight game is really about at its core, you're seeing a bunch of different versions of them in different combat sports spaces pop up all over the place. This one might be the most lucrative of them to date. We shall see in the end, but I suspect it's going to sell out. I suspect it's going to be a gigantic affair. I think the fight will probably be like a lot of other Jake Paul fights, unless Mike is really able to do something special. It'll probably be kind of slowish, kind of boringish, but in the end, we do know that Jake's got big power. And that has played a role for him. It's been the one thing that I think you could really point to as a legitimate threat to anyone he steps in there with. But again, his skill level has improved overall. I've done a tape study for Morning Combat if you want to check that out. So yeah, we'll have more on this as time progresses and we get some additional details. But that is pretty incredible. I'll say this about Jake Paul. I have been party to some of the fights he's been in, the ones that aired on Showtime. I have seen what he has built for himself. I have not loved necessarily his boxing fights, but I kind of respect the business hustle that he is putting together that is clearly proving to work. I mean, the model that he has built for himself, whatever else you want to say about it, it has worked quite well to this point, and it has been extremely lucrative. That cannot be denied. I don't know that I am fully convinced of his boxing progress. One of the points that I had made in the last fight, the last two fights that he had, the Andre August fight and the Ryan Borland fight, was that, people will say, oh, you're fighting someone at, your ninth or 10th fight who really isn't on the level, but that's what a lot of boxers do in their ninth or 10th fight, which is true. But just because he's also doing that kind of thing, it's not by itself proof of inevitability. But, he told me and Brian Campbell something a long time ago that, like, he was definitely going to get a fight ultimately with Canelo. And I don't want to sit here and tell you that that's going to happen, that because he's fighting Mike Tyson that we can assume he's going to get a fight with Canelo. But I'll say this for him. If he beats Mike Tyson and this fight ends up being as big as I think it will be, I think this fight will do gigantic numbers, especially if it's not on pay-per-view and you can just open up your Netflix account. I mean, the eyeballs on this are going to be extraordinary, right? If he does win and he does end up getting a Conor McGregor fight, I would no longer consider any kind of Canelo fight, exhibition or pro, to be a long shot at that point. This all sounds kind of crazy. I kind of scoffed at him in real time when he said it. I still don't think it's the likeliest outcome. But I got to tell you, the dude keeps raising the stakes here a little bit. I don't know if people are going to love this fight. In fact, I don't think that they will. But they're going to watch it, and it's going to be big, and he's going to make a lot of money. It's going to be a weird, interesting time. July 20th, Arlington, Texas. Here we go.